we have a very ambitious session to discuss crucial issues of social and religious plurality in the Abrahamic traditions in an hour or a little bit more than that. No, we have more time for that, but a lot of speakers. So if you agree, we have all description of the panel, short description and summary of panel written here. We have all short CVs here, and I will just, my function here will be to measure your time with some tolerance and to warn you when it should, you should mind the time, and also to announce the next speaker. Then we will have some time for discussion, hopefully, and I will moderate it. So the first speaker at this panel was supposed to be Dr. Aref Naed, and we have Dr. Aref Naed has been prevented of being here with us. However, Mr. Suhail Nakouda, his closest collaborator, is here with us, and we will listen to the presentation of Dr. Naed. During discussion, I hope that Mr. Nakouda will explain if there is a need and try to answer to the question.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your kind invitation to the Bosna Forum International, to this 18th conference on unity and plurality. My focus will be on the unity and plurality of reasoning. We humans often conflate many activities by calling them with the same name. For example, the activity we call seeing is not a single activity, but a multitude of activities. A horse being seen by an artist is a different object than a horse being seen by someone who dissects horses in order to know their anatomy. It's also different from a French cook looking at a horse as a potential meal. Seeing is not one activity, but a multitude of activities, and we conflate them by calling them by the same name. Similarly, what we call reasoning is not a single activity, but a multitude of activities. I would like to focus on the unity and plurality of reasoning, because I think it is from that unity and plurality that much of human unity and plurality stems. What we call reasoning is often thought of as a single activity governed by a single logic, or what Aristotle called an organon, so that the organon is supposed to be a normative methodology that actually governs this activity that we call reasoning. Sometimes we call it thinking, sometimes we call it cognition. However, it is often thought of as a single activity. I contend to say that reasoning is actually a multitude of activities. It includes not only the typical typologies of deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning and abductive reasoning that Aristotle first discovered and that was later elaborated by Charles Sanders Peirce, but it actually includes many other activities that have to do with the encounter between the human being and the objects around the human being. As we encounter the universe, as we encounter the world, nothing that we encounter is passive. Not even a stone is passive. For even a stone says, "Here I am." And even a stone posits its being and denies the beings of all others, in the sense that by positing its being, it occupies that space in the universe. So nothing is passive. All objects of reasoning are active, and some are more active than others. And even human objects, artifacts, are actually quite operational. They are operational artifacts, and they embody in them human intentionality. They are, as Emilio Betti said following Baratono, objectifications of spirit, or symbolic forms in the terminology of Cassira. The objects that we encounter in the universe are already active, already transformative, already operational, already involving many events and processes, as Bradley would say, and none of them are passive. As we encounter these active objects and we try to understand them, the reasoning that we exercise as we encounter this active, buzzing, operational, transformative world is actually a whole host of activities. For example, there is inquisitive reasoning, where we're asking questions. And Aristotle did an amazing job trying to catalog or give a typology of all possible questions that could be asked of any object. And in many ways, the categories of understanding that Aristotle discusses that are then reflected upon by many philosophers until Immanuel Kant tries to develop a more fundamental set of categories of understanding, and until Charles Sanders Peirce discovers that these categories of understanding are actually semiotic in structure. These categories of understanding are basically a catalog of questions that can be asked about being. When we encounter anything in the universe, that thing, is it? Where is it? When is it? How is it? Where does it come from? Where is it going to? All these questions make reasoning inquisitive. This is why the project of having a logic of questions and answers is vital. And it's unfortunate that the project has not been that developed. It is true that R.G. Collingwood kind of outlines it in his autobiography, but never really elaborates it systematically. It is true that Peirce actually develops some inquisitive reasoning logic that then gets developed by Dewey into the theory of inquiry. It is also that Hintikka, the Finnish philosopher, develops a logic of question and answer in what he calls the logic of the oracle. However, this logic needs to be developed further. Inquisitive reasoning is a very important type of reasoning, but it is not the only type of reasoning. There is also reasoning that is actually based on texts. There is a society for textual reasoning that was developed in the States, and then it became a society, or another society was developed out of it, which is the Society for Scriptural Reasoning. Reasoning that actually gets its propositions from texts, especially sacred texts, or artistic texts, or abundant texts, or what we can call saturated texts, is very different than reasoning that is actually not textually based. So that is a very different type of reasoning, and it's a very important type of reasoning. There is also reasoning that is infused with attitudes and with emotions that are extremely important for us humans. Professor Mark Gobin of George Mason University has written recently a book called Compassionate Reasoning, in which he actually looks at the neurology of compassion and the cognition of compassion, or compassionate cognition, and how compassion as an emotion actually influences the way we cognize things and we reason. So there is also compassionate reasoning. It's very important to realize that there isn't a single thing called reasoning, and that our attitudes, our presuppositions influence reasoning quite a bit. R.G. Collingwood, in his essay on metaphysics, actually pointed out that we all have absolute presuppositions, axioms if you like, and that all our reasonings are actually axiomatic systems that depend on some fundamental axioms beyond which we do not go. It is very important to analyze this axiomatic reasoning or presuppositional reasoning. How does that work? Also, the philosopher Ernst Bloch, in his book, The Principle of Hope, developed what we can call anticipatory reasoning. He said that Freud discovered the subconscious, but that there is a not yet conscience that is extremely important to focus on. The fact that humans always anticipate a utopia, always anticipate a future state, always have hope into something that is not yet, actually influences the very structure of reasoning. Anticipatory reasoning is not just reasoning. There is a difference between hopeful reasoning and reasoning that has a closed horizon. So the horizon of expectation, as Hans-Georg Gadamer explains in his famous book Wahrheit und Methode, Truth and Method, the horizon of expectations actually influences how we reason. So there is no unity in our reasoning. Perhaps there is only plurality in our reasoning. But is that the case? Perhaps there is a unity in the very complexity of our reasoning. Maybe we are united in having this complexity. So the question of unity and plurality, the question of simplicity and complexity are actually quite complicated. It is not so simplistic. All I want to say in these brief moments that I have, and I have been developing texts on this topic of the types of reasoning, the habits of reasoning, is that our unity and plurality actually is a reflection of a unity/plurality in our very essence of humanity, which is our reasoning capacity. And I believe that it is important to develop good habits of reasoning and to teach good habits of reasoning to our children. I believe that our reasoning has to be humble. We need to teach attitudes of humility to our children as they reason. Reason should not be a subject-object imposition. It should not be imperialistic, should not be arrogant. Reasoning should be humble. It should approach its objects with an attitude of receiving gifts and gratitude for gifts. Reasoning also has to be communal, in that we need to develop communities of interpretation, as Charles Sanders Peirce says, communities of interpreters who are helping each other to understand reality. We believe that reasoning should be dialectical, should be a to and fro, as Gadamer says. And as Plato said long ago in the symposium, the truth kind of manifests itself in the in-between between us. Reasoning has to be dialectical. Reasoning has to be hermeneutical in its attitude. It has to understand that there is a hermeneutical circle, that there is a relationship, an organic relationship between the parts and the whole, and also semiotic, in that we live in a universe of signs, where signs are interpreting signs, as Peirce explained in his work on semiosis, and semiotics developed later on by Charles Morris and also by the Tartu school. All of these features or habits of reasoning are habits that should be taught to our children. Therefore, I believe that yes, we can be united, but let us, in trying to be united, be aware also of the plurality of our reasoning, or the activities that we call with or use the single name of reasoning for, and that we pay attention to these varieties, respect them, and in humility try to help each other to understand our world better. Thank you very much for your kind attention. My colleague Suhail Nakhuda can discuss further these ideas, and he also has some of our writings on this topic. I very much regret not being with you, but I am in Benghazi, Libya, where advanced negotiations for a government, an interim government, are being conducted, and also where a parliamentary session is about to take place, for which I have to be present and prepared. I am very sorry that I'm not there with you, but I at least wanted to contribute this small video to participate and to express my gratitude to the organizers. Thank you very much. May God bless you and bless your work, and have a good day. Thank you.
So, thank you, Mr. Nakhuda, for being here with us and being ready to receive the questions. I now ask, I would like to introduce to you my colleague Desmond Maurer, Director of Center on History in the International Forum Bosnia, work on misinterpreting and sacrifice from world-making to self-denial.
Okay, hello, and it's nice to be here with everybody. I agree with a lot of what Aref said, so. But
shall we go
we'll just go straight on, yeah.
15 minutes, Desmond.
I know. Timer on. Basically, I've been thinking about this question of sacrifice for a long time, because when I started 30 years ago, dealing with the question of religion and similar things, it was to do with ancient Greek and ancient Roman religion and mythology, and sacrifice had a specific meaning under those circumstances, obviously, because one was dealing with animal sacrifice and a particular context. In the presentations that we heard earlier today, people may not particularly have noticed how often they made reference to the question of sacrifice. But it was the type of sacrifice, for example, with regard to the partisan graveyard. It was the type of sacrifice of those who have given up something for the rest of us, those who have made a sacrifice, which is quite a transfer in meaning. Sacrifice in Latin just means making holy. And that's how both Augustine and Aquinas treat it. And they talk about the external signs. The sacrifice is a gift of some sort or some type of act, which is an external sign of an internal change of mental state and an intention. It's got absolutely nothing to do with giving up anything from that perspective. When we think about animal sacrifice back in the religions of the ancient world, we do tend to think of there being something that is being killed or being given over, made a gift of, etc., and so that you are renouncing in some sort of way. But of course, in most of those systems, as they've been investigated by scholars like Jean-Paul Vernon, Pierre Vidal-Naquet, and so forth, what they found is, as most anthropologists find in a lot of other systems, is that what you're really dealing with is the distribution of a good. Okay, that the animal that's killed may in some cases be used as a holocaust, burnt up entirely or whatever, alienated fully, but in an awful lot of cases it's simply distributed amongst the people there, and its purpose is the same purpose more or less as the purpose of the gift, which is to mark out social relations and to mark out rank between people, to create social relations through the distribution, and to put everybody in a context with the divine. Okay, so that it's not giving up something per se. It's actually taking an object and using it to symbolize social relations and the relationship between the social group, the cosmos, the divine, and the individual. So that it's building this pattern. It's doing work of society and world making while it's happening, and it's operating the relationships between people at the same time. Now, there's a second aspect to this. What this suggests is that there are at least two different types of meaning of sacrifice. Okay, one of which is the gift, and the other one is world making, and they may come together. They may come together into a more coherent concept. So, as Aref was saying, there's a unity and a plurality. Okay, there's a unity in this idea that there's some type of symbolic ritual practice going on that is designed to help create meaningful contexts for people and help build people's own sense of self within a relationship to their societies and to their the world background. In fact, at a certain level, certain types of sacrifice, which are the cosmic sacrifices that Mircea Eliade and others talk about, where you build on this earth, you build a model or an image of the heavenly, of the heavenly construct, the temple, whether it's the temple, whether it's the church, whichever particular model you have. The altar, for example, in Hinduism, is essentially built and rebuilt and so on in order to carry out and continue the act of cosmic creation. So, and for that you need an object. For that you need what T.S. Eliot would have called an objective correlative. You need something to do your symbolic work on, and that's your sacrificial object. So, how is this related to the question to the question later on to the question of the partisan graveyard and things like this? These are places of the symbolic deconstruction and reconstruction of worlds for people. That's why they become meaningful, and that's why they are sacred. The sacred object, I mean, whether or not we're talking here about a transcendentalized sacred or an immanentized, secularized sacred, and that may sound like a contradiction in terms, but that's what's going on here, in that we have places that become crystallizations of values, and those values have to be given physical form. They have to be made to the context of symbolic or ritual practice, and they have to have people negotiate their relationships to each other through them. Sometimes those places go out of use, sometimes they come back into use. They're reoccupied in the way that, for example, the German Jewish philosopher Hans Blumenberg talked about the reoccupation of particular positions in the history of philosophy and so forth. That you find a space that no longer makes sense. And this is, one of the speakers earlier was talking about for Kosovo, not Kosovo, for Tirana. You were talking about whether or not the image can or should be changed, etc. But it can't stay the same, because once the old meaning's gone, it has to be reoccupied. The question is what form that reoccupation takes, and how we relate to reconstructing which original image, which hierarchy of pasts is constructed through that image and through how we then deal with it. And so which groups are brought into the totalization around that sacred object and through the sacrificial act, through this act of sacrifice. Again, understood in terms of making sacred, an external act that represents internal changes of attitude with regard to the divine. And then this leads me to more or less the final element of this, which is that we have to place this in terms of a long duration of change, so that we can then see how these elements of sacrificial ritual have changed in regard to the transcendental and the immanentized. Okay. I mentioned animal sacrifice at the beginning because animal sacrifice, when people think of ancient Greek religion or religions or tribal religions, African religions and so forth, and there's a wonderful book on sacrifice in Africa by the Belgian anthropologist Luc de Hirsch, where he analyzes a lot of these issues of how the object is used and how it is used to sacralize relations between people in relationship to the beyond, the transcendental. Because the transcendental is precisely that which guarantees the value of that through which we are trying to symbolize our relations. Okay? And only through some idea of a justifying above or beyond can we actually connect with these values in a way that's just for other people, in a way that transcends our own particular group interests, in a way that brings us beyond, again, I'm going to use the example of the partisan graveyard, because the partisan graveyard is contested for a reason. There are groups who felt excluded. There are groups whose history, whose family histories, goes back and says, but our dead have been excluded, or our suffering, which these people were involved in creating, has been excluded. We don't support this because we're not part of the totalization that you are presenting. We're outside of it. Your sacrifice has excluded us from the sacred, and therefore it's excluded us from the group. So that we don't have a way into your totalization. Okay? So the transcendental and the reference in divine justice, in some symbol of a justice that goes beyond the purely human, has been traditionally, at any rate, for societies, one of the ways in which this relationship is structured. Now, if we go back far enough, before the transcendentalization of God, because that basically happens in what Karl Jaspers referred to as the axial age. The axial age is a very iffy concept. It's not one that we can really always use. Eric Voegelin said that it was basically a sneaky way of just bringing the philosophy of history back into it all and creating teleological structures. But essentially, if you go back far enough, the divine is transcendent in a particular way. The divine is transcendent because the very structure of the cosmos is created out of the body of a transcendent divine. whether it's Tiamat, whether it's Uranus and Gaia, whichever symbols are there, there is a creation of this world out of a divine shell, out of the body of the first man and the first king, whichever did. This is then distributed through the first sacrifice, the first breaking up of a sacrificial animal or person, that then becomes the structure of the world, that is enacted through every single following sacrifice that founds the justice of society in that order. And that is the same story, the same symbolization as is to be found even in the Christian Eucharist. Now, Guy or Guy, I think it's Guy because of his French background, Strumsa, professor of Abrahamic traditions previously, wrote about 10 years ago a book on the end of sacrifice, in which he theorized, or which he argued, that sacrifice had ended as an act, as in animal sacrifice. The sacrificial act had ended in late antiquity, in what he referred to as a second axial age. Okay? And what he had in mind was not that there would never be reference to sacrifice again, but the sacrificial act no longer needed to take place because it had been subsumed and become a textual act, an act of remembrance. So in Christ, in one way, but he was actually more interested in terms of the destruction of the temple. And that after the destruction of the temple, in the Jewish tradition, you ended up with a turn against sacrifice. In ancient Greek paganism, the philosophers turned against sacrifice. They turned towards vegetarianism. There was a move to get rid of the use of the animal or human body as a sacrificial form. And this was then theorized as a great interiorization. Sacrifice was made a textual practice. It was made a ritual, symbolic practice that no longer actually carried out anything on a physical object. But it became a mental act. It became the mental act of submission. And that follows down through the philosophical tradition and to the theological tradition, to Kant and to Kierkegaard, both of whom require a submission of the mind and of the will in an act of sacrifice. And that act of submission and sacrifice informs every single one of the modern political religions. Every single modern political religion, like the religion that is represented up in the partisan graveyard, but also like fascism, also like liberalism, each of them requires a form of sacrifice. And that sacrifice, that's where we get this idea that sacrifice has to do with denying the self, giving up the self, self-abnegation, that you give yourself up for the group, that you take this act in the way that Christ, as the great exemplar of this, but it's not a purely Christian scheme, in the way that Christ gave himself up for all of us, in the way that previously Dionysus did. I've got 2 more minutes according to this.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
1 minute it was to.
Okay. If I can turn it off.
But as you are friend of mine, 2 minutes.
Okay. But basically, the idea is that each of the modern systems of secularized sacrifice, of those who've given their lives for the nation, of the children we sacrifice for the nation through armed service, of those who didn't give it on purpose, but whose sacrifice has to be respected, and so on. These are all forms of this spiritualization of sacrifice, which actually isn't a spiritualization. It's simply a detranscendentalization and an immanentization of an act that has now been bent out of shape, and that no longer means the same as it previously did. But it still carries out the second function of sacrifice, and that's the world-building one. Because it is still there as a central act where there is an objective correlative, a sacrifice, an object whom we have given over, a person whom we have given over, whose body now becomes the central focus for our understanding of how we build our relations between ourselves. And that's why we have to find ways, whenever we're trying to commemorate in this way, all of the things that we've been talking about today, that I've heard today, all of them come back to this issue of Lachlan Keeley talking in Dublin about the 2 sides in the Irish Civil War. All of them come back to how do the multiple narratives get built in so that there's always a minority report within the majority representation at a site of memory. So that there's always an understanding of who is excluded and their narrative is represented. Okay, so that when you go to the partisan graveyard, You can also find out about Bleiberg.
About?
Bleiberg. Okay, the way of the cross. You don't have to actually justify it. You don't have to say the Bleiberg fanatics are right. But what you have to show is this is why this site keeps on becoming, keeps on being vandalized, keeps on being desacralized. In fact, keeps on becoming an opposite taboo. Keeps on becoming a negative version of the positive. And you have to bring in all of these through, and you mentioned an interpretive center. Okay, and that is because we have to understand that the sacrifice isn't the gift of themselves of those who died. The sacrifice is the process of rendering sacred the symbols through which self, society, and the cosmos are brought into right relations under a symbol of justice.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you very
Okay.
much, Desmond. Thank you. Great. We will have discussion later, and I want to. You have to. So just write it down. It's sometimes good. It will be remembered. Yeah, that is. So, Rabbi Mordechai Bar-or will have a lecture on Bracha. Did I pronounce Aref?
It was okay.
You should be a blessing. What are the blessings of Abraham descendants for the 21st century, a Jewish perspective?
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I come from Jerusalem. I'm not an academic at all. I'm a rabbi. I am very active today in Israel with rabbis and Islamic leaders to understand the essence of Islam and Judaism and to think of Jerusalem as a blessed city, taking the conflicts and the differences into a creative mode of how can this city be a blessing, not only through conflict. And I will tell you my short journey how I got to this work today. So I'm a son of two Holocaust survivors. My name is Mordechai. My uncle, who was sent to Auschwitz at the age of 6. My mother was 11 children in the family. 6 survived the Holocaust, 5 were killed there. And I was brought up in a home where I was told that we Jews deserve. We deserve, after 2,000 years of exile, we deserve the land, the full land. We have power. It's a blessing to have so much power. And I would say my whole therapy, my whole journey in life is how to respect my parents, but to understand that Judaism isn't about being a victim. It's not about working through trauma, but it's about how to take responsibility once you have power. Once you're in a state, what does that mean? And what is the balance of power? And in a way, my whole life is talking to my parents with respect, embracing what they went through as children, but understanding that my maturing, my leadership is about going to the essence of Judaism and trying to understand how can this repair the world. And today, my new position is to work with Islamic leaders and Jewish leaders in a world which is going through so many changes, how to make a better world through the religions. See the religion not as the problem, but as the solution. That's my work today. Now, I want to very briefly share with you a biblical journey, which I think is very important. We share a joint, in Islam it's a prophet, for us it's our father, Abraham. I want to very quickly go over the journey in the Bible until Abraham appears. I think it's very important to understand my perspective coming from Judaism. Why is Abraham so important? So in the Bible, and this is like, I have a book about this. I'll do this in 7 minutes. It's really a bit crazy. But in the Bible, the core story is the Garden of Eden, where there's harmony between God. The river is the nurture. The trees are the food, and there's a real intimacy between God and man. Life is full of well-being and then the woman is invited into the story. Between the Garden of Eden and Abraham, there are 4 stories that I think are very important for me, and I think you may understand where I come from. The first story outside the Garden of Eden is Cain and Abel, where 2 brothers were hoping to live together. Brothers aren't only relatives, they symbolize brotherhood, something much wider than the family element. And that story failed because of jealousy, because of the need of positionness of Cain. But this is a universal story that didn't succeed, and it showed the failure of brotherhood. The second story, which is less known even to people who love the Bible, it's a very difficult story, but it's the story that leads to the flood. And the story is about the sons of leaders. In the Torah it says Elohim, of God, but the literal meaning isn't the sons of God, it's sons of people who have power, who simply abuse women. That's what they do. They take women, use them as they want, and it's the first abuse of women in history. And this leads to the flood, which is taking the world back to almost the beginning. The third story is when Noah leaves the ark. He creates a vineyard, and he gets drunk. And as he's drunk, one of his sons, Ham, sees he's nude, and he does something sexual to his father. It's unclear in the literal text what happened there, but it's clear that it's a dishonorable act of his son towards his father. These 3 stories out of the 4 are about family. The first is about brothers. The second is about the whole understanding of intimacy, man and woman relationship. The third story is how do parents continue the tradition through the children. Noah wasn't a good example by getting drunk in front of his kids. One of the kids, Ham, did a very not honoring act towards his father, and this again has failed. The fourth story is the story of the Tower of Babel. In a very quick understanding, it's where man feels he's stronger than God. We can compete, we can win over God. It's about being hubris, it's about not understanding the limits of creativity. And I just want to say something very quick. These 4 stories, one about brothers and brotherhood, second about man, wife, intimacy, the use of women as objects. The third, how do parents and children continue in a harmonious way to give future generations the tradition. And the fourth story, the limits of creativity, are crucial things that the world today is facing. Even though this was done many, many years ago, these are elements that the modern world, and I won't go into examples, but you can imagine each one of them, still it's on its way, we say in Hebrew, tikkun, to fix something which is broken. And God, in our tradition, one day, after all these happened, says to Abraham, Lech lecha, take a journey. The end of the journey ends with the words, V'hiyeh bracha, which means in English, you shall be a blessing. Now the blessing that Abraham has to bring the world has to deal with those 4 stories, because those 4 stories are failure stories. They didn't succeed, which means the children of Abraham, it's not just saying we want to pray together in Jerusalem or have a spiritual life. We have to go into the real issues the modern world is facing. And I won't have time to go into those 4 elements I spoke about before, but each one of them represents so much. Is there brotherhood? Is there proper intimacy today in the world? Do parents and children know how to continue the tradition in a proper way? And the fourth is about economy. It's about technology, the limits, the boundaries. All these elements are things that the sons of Abraham today, in the 21st century, have to face and work together to create a better world. So what I'm saying here is, I deeply believe that the religions have a lot to contribute to 21st century world questions. It needs humbleness. It needs to understand that even though I grew up in a family that, after 2,000 years of exile and the Holocaust, that doesn't mean that you're a victim. That means you are responsible to make a better world. It's a lot of therapy. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of pain. But not use trauma as a way to say, I deserve to take trauma into a new level of responsibility. 10 months ago, I met Dr. Aref in Abu Dhabi. And the first thing he said to me, let's study together. And we studied together Levinas. It was a shocking meeting between him and myself. We studied some Zohar. I'm sitting in a conference of 500 Muslims, 10 Jews and 20 Christians, and I'm studying Chavruta. I'm studying in a pair with Aref, and we created, I would say, a very special partnership. And since then, with different leaders, I believe that our responsibility as Jews, Muslims, Christians, is to try to understand the vision. Now, let's say one thing. Everybody here is talking a lot about how to preserve the past. In our tradition, in Judaism, past and memory is very central. And I believe it's time to talk about what is the future all about. We cannot be dominated by preserving the past. And I'm saying this as an Orthodox Jew, and past is a lot to me, but it's time to talk about what is our vision for the world, and through the vision, go back to reality and create together a better future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for controlling your time and for the wonderful lecture. I just would like to invite Mr. Friar Ivo Marković to talk about changing paradigms in Abrahamic theologies.
Thank you. Greetings to all of you. Thank you for excellent lectures. I enjoyed listening to you. I hope you will also enjoy listening to me. So the title of my lecture presentation is Changing Paradigms in Abrahamic Religions. First paradigm shift from mechanistic to quantum paradigm. The word paradigm, respectively a paradigm change, turning epoch, is being used more frequently in contemporary languages, expressing the spirit of our times. Last year in Germany, the word Zeitwende, turning point, was the word of the year. Pope Francis very frequently describes our epoch as a turning point. Especially in everyday colloquial language, this word became frequent. But it is very unclear what is turning and what is changing. This change is apparently multi-layered. Sometimes it connotes geopolitical change after the attack of Russia on Ukraine. Some imply enormous technological progress, especially in artificial intelligence or ecological challenges. Yet, yes, must be rare. There is in mind the most fundamental shift from the Newton-Cartesian mechanistic shift to the quantum paradigm, lasting already 1 century. The new age was initiated with the enthusiasm in humanism in the Renaissance, and it animated a strong faith in human being able to rule the human world. Nicola Copernic abandoned the geocentric view to heliocentric one. Johann Kepler and Galileo Galilei prepared the most advanced mechanistic theory of Isaac Newton in the 17th century. as a fundamental basis of understanding the world. Darwin's theory of evolution was just affirmation of all of it. Newton's mechanistic theory was based on matter. Matter was universal based, and each consequence had its cause. Everything was strongly determined, rational, logical, statistical, petrified, unilateral, divided, subjective, and objective. Each phenomenon had its base in the matter. Each physical and spiritual disease can be healed with medicaments, also the consciousness and conscience. Everything was in the matter. Such materialism was petrified in totalitarian communism, and such scientific progress culminated in the destruction of the nature as environment of life generally. It all created doubt in the fundamental of our civilization. Something was rotten in our civilization. The beginning of the 20th century started a dramatic revolution in science. During some decades became questioned the fundamental notions of time, space, and consciousness. There was very clear discovered that nature is in its intimacy, is interwoven with our experience. Human beings are not only objective observers of reality, which is dependent of us. We are co-creators of the reality we live in. I will cite Max Planck. He wrote, "There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of force. We must assume behind this force the existence of conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as the derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing postulates consciousness." So write Max Planck. In each case, it was strange why so radical implications of the new physics had so small influence on our everyday experience of reality. The answer is dynamic of paradigm shift. A paradigm to be shifted, there must be created a critical quantity of anomalies and crisis-provocating necessary change to the compound environment of the epoch. But this fundamental paradigm echoes in religions in an extremely powerful way. First of all, in theology, but especially in the core of the faith, in the mystics, and it has its reflex in the dialogue among religions, in the mirroring among religions, looking and influencing mutually one another. Something about quantum metaphysics in Christianity. In Christian theology, quantum metaphysics gave rise to the discovery of how ideas of quantum metaphysics already were present in the entire theological and mystical tradition, especially in East Orthodox theology from the first millennium, when Christianity was expressing itself from the paradigm of time, life, to the geometric paradigms and static paradigm of Greek spirit. You know, the Bible experience came to exist as experience of life, true life of nation, individuals. Greek philosophy is fully different, is materialistic, practically atomistic, and first millennium of Christianity was to express Christianity in the spirit of this Greek spirit. In that Christianity synthesis, the central issue were the relationship between God and the world in the Bible revelation and the philosophical tradition, reflection. The core issue was the reconciliation between unquestioned God's transcendence and His immanence. The first reputable theologians from the 1st century, Clement of Alexandria and Holy Irenaeus, and later Maxim Confessor from 7th century, but especially Gregorius Palamas in the 14th century, confirmed God's transcendence. God is fully transcendent in his essence, in Greek language, housia, but very close in his power, in his presence, dynamic, embracing entire creation. It means that God, albeit fully transcendent, by his energies creates and maintains the entire creation. French philosopher and theologian Jesuit Teilhard de Chardin, in first half of the 20th century, elaborated a circular evolution theory asserting that God first created consciousness, evolving in the mother and then later back to consciousness. From such a tradition in relationship between God and the world, contemporary theology is challenged with quantum metaphysics, creating a very mystic relationship between God and the world, called panentheism. Panentheism, not pantheism. Panentheism literally means to immerse, to be immersed deeply into God. All creation comes to exist from God's energy, we call love and grace, and immersed in it has been living. Human beings with their consciousness are directly immersed in God's energy, pervading all creation. Such panentheistic spirituality is being reflected in ecological, peacemaking, ecumenical, and interreligious theology, in peacemaking dynamism, and in the discovery of the linkage of all creation. Something about quantum metaphysics in Jewish spirituality. Quantum metaphysics found a similar echo in Jewish spirituality as in Christianity, for example, in the philosophy of Diagon from 9th century, Maimonides 12th century, but especially in Kabbalah mystics, finding that the ideas of quantum physics already were present there. Kabbalists elaborated on a system where the universe is maintained by divine energy flowing from God in a transcendental way, in a similar way as in Christianity, as in Christian panentheism. Contemporary Jewish writer Eduard Schifrin paraphrases Kabbalah and at the beginning of the Bible puts the sentence, "In the beginning, God created information." Something about quantum metaphysics in Islam. Islamic theology very willingly speaks about quantum Islam, which is not only faith, customs, and rituals, but is developing, growing, and living as living Quran. The discovery of quantum physics just proves Quranic cosmology because the quantum description of reality looks for the existence of a non-physical spirit behind the physical realm. Many Islamic theologians argue how quantum metaphysics discovers what already was asserted in Quran. Quantum metaphysics is acknowledgement of the Quranic worldview. In conclusion, Abrahamic traditional religions are living in an actual institutional crisis of faith and institution, and they are turning back to renewal in religious experience. In the context of facing quantum metaphysics pushes all of them in the direction of new mystics and the inspiration already present in their traditions. Now, there is a special chance for these religions to keep their meeting on the level of the metaphysics, which could open new perspectives in the interreligious dialogue and understanding. Just remind, some 5-7 years ago, I invited Lawrence Freeman, one Benedictine expert in meditation and mystics, and we invited some Jewish spirituals, Muslim, Orthodox, Catholic in Sarajevo, and it was just one attempt to meet on the level of the mystics, of the experience of faith. And it is very interesting how on the level of experience we are so near, regardless are we Jews or Christians or Muslims or atheists. So, thank you.
Thank you. Dear Marković, I would like now to welcome Dr. Asim Zubčević. Welcome, Marko, who will talk about sacred places in a changing world and the world to be changed.
Thank you, Amra. Thank you all. I will also take the stand here for you to better or to equalize the distribution of my voice to those of you who are still willing to listen after the coffee is being served. Thank you for the opportunity, really, to share my thoughts, my research, my ideas, my, I would say, inquiries that is definitely touching on many of the points already being taken or stated here in different perspectives. I will try to briefly explain the title and the idea of my presentation today. It was some weeks ago that I was in Stolac and I was kindly invited by my dear friend and colleague, Professor Osman Đikić, to visit him in his house and to have a coffee, over which we discussed several issues, and then I offered one idea for today's presentation, and I tried to have his feedback and I would say certain comments on how would it fit the perspective of the social religious plurality in Abrahamic traditions, and it was quite well. I tried to focus three different things. One is the sacred or sacred places, and I was thinking originally about sacred sources, but then I decided to use sacred places rather than sources, and I'll explain why. The second phenomenon is the changing world that we're living in, which is in the same time the third phenomenon, and that is a world to be changed. And I'll try to figure different connections between those three entities. I'll start with one fact, which is that in 1967, a German engineer named Wolfgang Hilberg patented a radio-controlled clock. So the watches, or in German Funkuhr, if you know probably. So the idea was to have one central place to send radio waves and signals to control and adjust watches all around the region or perhaps worldwide. And this fact is not so important on its own, but the fact that it happened in the late 60s, when the whole world was really living the peak of postmodernistic perspective, if you want, so crashing all the safe ground for any type of reality understanding or any authority, I would say, explanation of the reality that was dissolving or disappearing before our very eyes, was something that is completely different, which shows a message that there is one place and one source where the information on what time is it. And of course, I'm not going into philosophical and other dimensions of time. I don't have time to have more time about time. But it really shows different approach, a different perspective, which is, in my view, perhaps a reflection to something that was changing in the world. And that was subconsciously sending a message that we need some source, we need some crucial point to be fixed or hooked on. We need something solid to feel more safe, to control our fears, which is obviously not the tactical dimension, obviously, so what time is it? And we have still different times, and I guess if we had all the watches on our cell phones and hand wristwatches in this very room, we'll probably not have all the same, perhaps in minute, but not in the second, etc. So we have different information and different notion about the time if you want to get precisely method. So the very fact that we have different information on what is really the time right now or ever is bringing us to position to start thinking about the change itself. Because the change is something that happens in time or over time, or something that Desmond already mentioned, that if we want to focus on something, we have to follow it in diachronic perspective. And to see this, if you want, historical or diachronic perspective of anything that is changing. And that is really beautiful in a presentation about Abraham as a symbol of changing previous narratives and stories that were corrupt and that were distorting the central position of existence, if you want. And different stories that are changing our view, and as someone has said, the scene is different if you're seen by a veterinarian or by an artist, etc. So we have really different notions and different perspectives that happen in time. So the change is probably the only permanent thing according to Heraclitus. Everything is changed except the change. It's the only constant thing is the change. Now, I try to think of it and I'll try to challenge it. Even the change is changing. Why? Because, for example, if you want, changes before were much slower and much more focused and much more local than today. So even the change is changed, if you want. The change as such, and I mean, explaining, not having the ability nor any aspiration to explain the changing world, but to try to think and understand the change of the world in the changing world, is something I try to have this diachronic perspective and to have three structural elements of understanding the change. First would be to establish the elements of change, what has changed, what was or remained authentic and what has changed, so what has altered or transformed, if you want. The second would be what were the agents of a change, or of the change. So what influenced and what sources of power in, if you want, a way that Foucault has presented the importance of the agents of power addressing the change. And the third would be the dynamics of change, which I already mentioned, which is the time frame and pace of change as such, which is important to understand if you want to think about changing world. So, if really the only constant is the change, I believe we can ask ourselves the question of the rhythm of change. So the change today is different than before. And before is different than before. So really the change itself has its own dynamics of change. The change happens in a certain space. So time is really a change, or we can understand time as a change in Heideggerian or other perspective, but not only. The change has its playground, its platform. So the effects of change and elements of change have to show, and they're shown in some space. And that's why I decided to talk about sacred spaces and not sacred sources. Even though the response to the change is really today somewhat different, or at least I see it that way, is rather more fragmented and insufficient than the responses to changes were before. So even in my lifetime, which is a quite, I would say, limited and relative, it's less than 50 years, I remember that changes in my childhood, in my youth, were given us as a society, not just me as an individual, enough time to adjust, to prepare, to respond, and to really react to certain changes. Even if it's a change of fashion, it's a change of textbooks in schools, if it's for change of liturgical life in certain religious perspective, etc. So all different changes were slow, as compared to the ones today. Slow, it means graduate and open to reception. It was interesting what Desmond mentioned, and I understood it, that even talking about divine, it was limited by the capacity of this contingent or immanent perspective and its reception. So even the old divinity is limited by our capacity to somehow respond or to articulate whatever is being presented during any change in our, I would say, contingent perspectives. So currently, big changes in the world, big changing world today, I try to recognize as the digital world that has brought a tremendous, or I would say, a big, gigantic change in posture, in perspective, and in understanding of reality. And not just in Baudrillard's meaning of simulated or simulacrum as a perspective of one understanding, but also in the, I would say, almost infinite ways of unknown understandings of digital and virtual as opposed, or I would say differentiated from the physical reality that we are living in our lives. The other important thing that I was not having enough time to pay attention to is the interwinding, or I would say amalgam of digital or virtual life with the physical world. The second great change in the changing world is the global perspective. Almost on a daily basis, vast majority of information that we receive is based on global perspective. It's not local perspective anymore. It's not the news that our neighbor came back from Germany after years working there. It's not the perspective that someone came back from Hajj, or someone has get a new grandchild, etc. So almost the vast majority of information that we are overwhelmed with is something that happened in Mexico, South Korea, Nicaragua simultaneously, and what's going on in Ukraine and I don't know, anywhere else in the world. So the perspective of us being objectives of information, of changing information, is really primarily global rather than local. And the third, I would say, element of a changing world is that it's still, even though oxymoronic and paradoxical, but still a big factor of change is that we are under influence of the big capital. So the big capitalistic perspective of centers of power is really, in my opinion, among the key drivers of global changes. So what is the direction of change? If we can call it the change or a change in the global perspective. I will borrow words from Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, who said that in self-governed democracy, one of the most needed things is the high degree of cohesion. Cohesion. So the high degree of cohesion. Of course, he meant several things, but I was struck by the potential of this symptom, because high degree of cohesion can be presented in various ways. For example, if big areas of change, digitalization, globalization, and capital, are bringing certain fears, and that's what change always brings, on psychological perspective, as fears. If digitalization is bringing the fear of unknown, or destructing what we have known, then what would be the need? It would be the need to know, to recognize, to be recognized, and to recognize. If it was the change of globalization, it would be the fear of loneliness, or I would say individualization, And then it would be the need, the answer to it would be the need of belonging. And thus, the big collective identity processes, etc. And if it was the big change of the big capital, the fear would be, I would say, financial and social slavery, which respond to would be active participation. And this is what Charles Taylor is directly advocating for. So the political, social participation, active participation. Now, if this is the changing world, and these are opportunities from change to fear, to have certain needs recognized or fulfilled, and I'm about to close to finish.
Thank you.
Is to have the instruments of following the change. The instruments would be, on level of digitalization change, it would be an information. And there was rightly said, and in the beginning God created information, which is something that Freire said in a funny way that corresponded. But this information is only an instrument to discover a source to reach the goal, and source would be dialogue. So Charles Taylor advocates for mutual understanding and recognition. Not just recognition of, as asking for my rights and my position, but mutual understanding and recognition, which comes through dialogue, and the goal would be to build the trust. Really. Secondly, if it was only about the globalization problem, and the fear would be the individualization and being lost in the world, the instrument would be really to build frameworks, like such group did here, or any other group, to bring people together, and that would have consensus on certain values. And those values would then be the fundament of bringing position for common culture. So the goal would be common culture. What this common culture would bring, either partisan graveyard with a footnote on others that were left out from the picture, or any other place, it's up to us to agree based on values that we share and to organize and bring together whatever we recognize as such. And on the level of, I would say, probably the most influential and most impactful change, which is the capital, the financial, economic, or social dimension, the instrument would be really the activism or activity. And the source would be the self-governed society, and the goal would be the high degree of social cohesion. This is really understanding. Now, just putting back to the title, the sacred places, which are obviously not just sacred scriptures, but also sacred places physically, as if you want in axial world, as Desmond mentioned, it's the places of pilgrimage or worship or shrines, etc. But also the modern or secular shrines, if you want, like Chernobyl in Ukraine, like Ground Zero in New York, like Srebrenica, that Asim had mentioned, like Vukovar and Jasenovac and many others, Yad Vashem, many others. So those are places, sacred places, that emanate or radiate certain information that are a fundament for certain values that will bring social cohesion in I would say, an optimal way of dealing with it. So the question is, where and how can those frequencies be harmonized and adjust for different sacred places to bring change for the world to be changed? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we can make a covenant to listen to each other.
Exactly.
And,
For a change.
Yeah, for a change. And there is one place in the world, Gallipoli, where the memorial is the memorial to the sons of all mothers who were mourning the death of their children, be them Australian, New Zealandian, or Turks. So that's unique memorial where all those who in fact felt they were enemies, they were fighting against each other, but for all those who felt there at Gallipoli there is one memorial. and that's, as far as I know, unique memorial is about. So
But
let
it's
us.
left fathers.
Where is it?
Gallipoli.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Uh-huh.
They left out fathers. They only
Yeah.
appreciated mothers.
Yes. They left. Oh my God! I was about mothers. Then, yeah. Okay. Now we are a little bit behind the time, but I don't know about you. Before and after the coffee, it was some kind of a celebration of sorts for me, listening to all of you. Rusmir Mahmučehajić will talk about the transcendence and immanence of God in the Abrahamic traditions, a Quranic view, and he informed me that he will use anthropological methods.
Thank you, Amra. Thank you to all of you. You know, in the revelation sent down from God to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam, we can read that God was sending his prophets to all people. All prophets, or all of his messengers, were speaking in the language of their people. Therefore, if we take into account today that we have 6,000 languages, that many of them disappeared, that some of them will appear in future and so on, according to this, it means in all languages there is a prophet. On other places in the same book, you can read, God never sent a prophet who was not saying, or not revealing, I am God, there is no God but I, and serve me. So, if God was speaking via his prophets in all languages, we, accepting relations with the God, have our heritage in all languages. In language of my mother language, it was praxis. Anytime you mentioned somebody who passed away, no matter who is he, you would say a small prayer. Rahmet njegovoj duši, meaning mercy to his soul, or to her soul. The first language I learned, beside my maternal language, was French. And in French, of course, you know to say thank you is merci. Then, when I was in Kazan, center of old Kazan Hanat, Tatarstan, that was destroyed by Russians 500 years ago, in horrific way. They said, I asked them usually, how do you say thank you? They said, Rahmet. Like we in Bosnia, when we are mentioning our people passed away. When I would say in the shop, or some of my colleagues on university, Rahmet, they were smiling, they were very satisfied, because it was their relation with themselves. Later, as you know, in English, Rahmet, Rahma is mercy. In the same book you have that God said only for two things that he with them embraces everything. God embraces with his knowledge everything. God embraces everything with his knowledge, God embraces everything with his mercy. You know, essentially, mercy is something which is very close to us. You cannot imagine mercy that is far away from you, not with you, not with that, with whom you are in the relations. Mercy is inner situation of any individuals. On the other place in the same book you can read, the most noble of you is the most conscious. And being conscious is really speaking great mystery. And this mystery can bring us back to this plurality of languages, in my view, my interpretation. You know, to be conscious that we are conscious, you always have two positions. Object of our consciousness and subject of being relations with us who are conscious. Always something on higher level than this object. How we can get this high level? As soon as we get that we are conscious of that, it is going up. No time we can get this really speaking source of consciousness. And if we go back to these questions, human being cannot stop anywhere. He is looking for the beginning. No matter when he starts. We have very short time, let's say, short time in our life, but we are always asking ourselves, what is beginning? How it starts? Where is the end? Forgetting that as soon as we get the question about beginning, as Marko was trying to explain, beginning must be outside of the time and the space. As soon as it gets, even in the smallest instant, in quanta of time, it is already time and the space. But the real beginning doesn't have time and the space. So, the real beginning cannot be posited anywhere in the space and the time. It is absolutely close to everything, near to everything, and far away from everything. Modern science was trying to exclude that. We can wrestle with, let's say, the first millionth part of the second, and so on, but what is beginning? And we are, let's say, making it a black spot on which we cannot speak. Though it is in the presence of everything we think about. Imagine, please, any law of nature. Somebody mentioned here Newton, imagine Maxwell, imagine Einstein, Heisenberg, and even the last experiments referring to so-called intermingledness of quanta and so on. Always you will present this law with what? With an equation, no matter which equation. Newton's, Maxwell's, Einstein's, Schrödinger and so on. It is always equation. And each equation is with three parts, with three entities, the right and the left. The right and the left are measurable, expressible in the numbers, expressible in the form of behaviors, or let's say probability, and so on, like in Schrödinger's equation. But on the other side, there is something in that we are playing like in theater, hiding that it is obvious, but we are not seeing that. This is equal connecting the right and the left side. For the right and the left side, we can say quantity, time, property, and so on, space. But for this is equal, we are not saying it. Is it measurable? Does it have time, beginning, and is it divisible, and so on? And is it the third of three? Or it is third of two? So, going back into question of contingency, everything what is in existence, everything what was created, everything what is contingent is divisible. There is no any instant of time, no point of the space that is not divisible. You know, this mystery of antique in which some thinkers were thinking about, is it possible to have atom, something indivisible? This is now, in some way, fantasy, Nothing what is in existence cannot be undivisible. Time and space are divisible, therefore contingent. They always have the here which is indivisible. So, you will see also in the same book, God is the third of two. God is fourth of three. God is, and so on and so on. He is absolute other. He is being absolute otherness. Other means absolutely close, immeasurably close to everything in time and space, quantity and so on. And absolutely, absolutely incomparable with anything that manifests him. Duality, but all existence is in duality. Each particles of this existence is divisible, but always the one is the truth is manifested, confirmed with this duality. Going back to the mercy, you know, in the same tradition, you know, we are many times quarreling among ourselves. Who is we are worshipping? What is name of him? And so on. How we could present him? In this tradition it is said, if you ask about him, God or merciful, all of his names are the most beautiful. Beauty is something that cannot be measured. It cannot be blocked. We can, let's say, carve up anything, but beauty is escaping from that, escaping from any of our presentation, the language. And we have feeling that we are masters, Lord, of our speech, though it is quite obvious that we are not masters of, let's say, any galaxy, any atom, and so on. And our being, let's say, against ourselves, taking gods beside God, is usually in the space of our language. We think that what we are speaking, we are lords of our speech. But any serious physician will tell you, will confirm, yes, I know when something is measurable, how to describe it within the boundaries, within my paradigm of this. But I don't know where is origin of any change, any start, any movement. So is with the language. Language must have, even in accordance with all knowledge of modern neurology, position rooted in something what is outside of the time and the space. In that, what would be considered absolute, full consciousness. Absolute being is absolutely conscious. Absolute being is absolutely merciful. Absolute being is absolute peaceful, absolute peace. In contingency in which we are, all of that could be manifested in relations to opposite of that. But there is no opposition to the absolute. This is in contingency duality that is presenting full presence, full immanence, absolute immanence of the truth is equal but not comparable, and so on. You know that also in the same book on which I'm referring, you will find following. Abraham, peace be upon him, asked his father and his compatriot, are you worshipping that what you made with your hands, though God created you and what you are making? So he said explicitly in that even idols, wooden, stone, bronze. Yeah, it was time of the bronze, is it? Time of Abraham, maybe it is. Essentially, it was originating, created by God. Nothing could be created outside of the God. Our responsibility is what we are doing. And so, going back, you know that 50 years ago, in this our great obsession with the science that became totalitarian religion, nobody know of serious science will take science as it was present, let's say 50 years ago. You know that somebody mentioned Max Planck today. Max Planck said once upon a time, we will have full science when the art of observer, of scientist, would be fully excluded from everything we are describing, from everything we are experimenting with, and so on. 2 minutes there. Okay. However, today it is Max Planck, who was very wise, passionate, even very practical religious man. It is, in the perspective of modern physics, stupid. Today, absolutely nothing serious of the world we are monitoring, observing, trying to, cannot be taken without inclusion of observer. And this intangible, you know, if you would say, we show here a particle, her entanglement with the farthest particle in the cosmos must be of the same, not to describe you, spin, and so on and so on. So what we have today as results of our knowledge in the quantum physics is fully dismantling our prejudices of previous scientific paradigms.